The Kremlin, which is facing accusations of war crimes for its invasion of Ukraine, has denounced the US and the EU for having double standards when it comes to the Middle East. Beijing, meanwhile, is trying to promote its image as a mediator. Russia is presenting itself as a champion of peace in the Israel-Hamas conflict, while defending the largest invasion in Europe since World War II. The United States and the EU, on the other hand, appear to believe that sanctions do not apply when the right to self-defense involves the indiscriminate bombings of civilians in the Gaza Strip and attacks in the West Bank. This posture in support of Israel has sparked a wave of accusations of double standards. Russia criticizes Western powers for condemning attacks on civilians and key infrastructure in Ukraine, while at the same time justifying allegedly similar Israeli actions under the pretext of defending against Hamas. Russia and China are seeking to take advantage of this situation in the fight to control the narrative. The battlefield is the United Nations Security Council, where Beijing and Moscow vetoed a Washington resolution last week as it did not urge Israel to lay down its weapons. Another Russian resolution that did not include Israel's right to defense also failed to receive the minimum necessary votes. It has become clear that the U.S. simply doesn't want UN Security Council decisions to have any kind of influence on a possible ground offensive by Israel in Gaza, said Russia's UN ambassador, Vasily Nebenzia. Moscow and Beijing have been singing the same tune almost since the beginning of the war between Israel and Hamas. It is no coincidence, but rather another result of the strategic partnership and friendship without limits between the two countries, which they announced 3 weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. China and Russia have positioned themselves relatively clearly in the current conflict, criticizing Israel although using diplomatic language, without explicitly condemning Hamas, and loudly criticizing the US and the West's support for Israel, explains Bjorn Alexander Dubin, an associate professor at Jilin University in China. It may be somewhat surprising, adds this analyst, since both Beijing and Moscow have maintained good relations with Israel in recent decades. The conflict serves to advance their common objective of strengthening ties with the countries in the global south, especially in the Muslim world, he adds. A couple of weeks ago, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian leader Vladimir Putin met again in Beijing. Although they did not issue a joint statement on the conflict in the Middle East, the official Chinese statement said that China is ready to work with Russia to step up communication and coordination within the United Nations and other multilateral organizations. Putin, an advocate in the Palestinian case of the creation of an entirely new state, as recommended by UN Resolution 181 in 1947, used the antithesis of this argument to justify his invasion of Ukraine, whose existence he does not accept. He made this argument in speeches on February 21 and 24, 2022, when he launched a massive land, sea, and air offensive that included the bombardment and assault of major urban centers such as Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Kyiv. The Kremlin is trying to maintain a delicate balance in the region. Iran is a key ally of Russia. It helps it evade Western sanctions and obtain ammunition. While Israel, the destination of many Russian exiles, is also a major trading partner, and Jews are one of the country's main minority groups. Russia benefits from this seismic shift because Western allies are strained by continuing their military and financial support for Ukraine, says Kawa Hassan, an analyst at the Carnegie Middle East Center. Russia's ambivalence was reflected in the two closed-door emergency meetings at the UN Security Council on October 8 and 13. The meetings ended without any joint statement due to Moscow's refusal to condemn Hamas. 2 public meetings later followed. It's common for the 5 powers on the Security Council to veto resolutions. Since 2011, Moscow has rejected up to 17 proposed resolutions on another key issue in the region, the Syrian war. The last time Russia used its vetoing rights was in July. This led to the temporary closure of the passage of humanitarian aid to the northwest of the country through the Turkish Bab al-Hawa corridor. Approximately 85% of the support for the civilian population crosses that stretch. The deal was finally extended for another 6 months at the end of August. However, other vetoes are final. Russia, for example, refused in October 2017 to allow the UN Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to investigate Bashar al-Assad's chemical weapons attacks against his population. When Putin announced his invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, he argued that old treaties and international agreements are no longer effective after the demise of the Soviet Union. The president gave as an example NATO's intervention in Yugoslavia, which had not been approved by the United Nations, the unilateral U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, and America's intervention in Syria, which was done without the approval of the al-Assad regime. He also argued that UN approval was distorted when NATO acted against Gaddafi in Libya. China recognizes Palestine as a state and has a historical connection to the territory, which is linked to the national liberation movements of the Cold War. But Beijing has tried to stay out of the war and present itself as a friend of Israel and Palestine. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has been in contact with both foreign ministries. The pressing task now is to stop the situation from further escalating and causing a more serious humanitarian disaster, he told his Israeli counterpart, Eli Cohen, last week. China deeply sympathizes with the plight of the Palestinian people, especially the people in Gaza, he told Palestinian Foreign Minister Riyad al-Maliki. Professor Dubin considers that neither China nor Russia has a special interest in the conflict. Nevertheless, he adds, given the geopolitical tensions in recent years, the fact that the U.S. and its major allies have taken a supportive stance toward Israel provides an incentive for Beijing and Moscow to do the same and take a contrary stance, as during the Cold War. Dubin points to another reason in light of the constant flow of images of civilian suffering in Gaza. Both Beijing and Moscow can portray the United States and its allies because of their support for Israel as irresponsible and guilty of double standards when it comes to human rights violations and alleged war crimes. They can use this to deflect Western criticism of Russian war crimes in Ukraine or China's treatment of the Uyghur Muslim minority in its Xinjiang region. In a previous video, we have already quoted Wang Yi saying that China is responsible for the wave of reconciliation in the Middle East. He pointed to a deal brokered by China to restore diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia as evidence of China's peacemaking abilities. Wang emphasized China's pragmatic approach to international relations, focusing on trade and non-judgmental cooperation. Chinese officials even expressed a willingness to tackle the Israeli-Palestinian conflict after successfully mediating between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Chinese scholars with ties to the country's intelligence services published a paper arguing that foreign interventions by the US, UK, France, and the Soviet Union had failed in the Middle East. In contrast, China promoted dialogue and mutual respect as a mediator, emphasizing its ability to balance conflicting interests. Wu Bingbing, director of the Institute of Arab Islamic Culture at Peking University, praised China's focus on development, security, and refusal to take sides in an article. Despite the looming conflict between Hamas and Israel, China's confidence in its role as a mediator remains strong. China's economic ties and trade partnerships with many Middle Eastern countries gave it a vested interest in avoiding a regional conflagration. However, China's autocratic worldview, which avoids lecturing Middle Eastern rulers on human rights, continued to appeal to these leaders. Additionally, China's refusal to label Hamas as a terrorist organization and downplaying Hamas atrocities in state media drew criticism from politicians in the US and Israel.